At 2 in the morning, the lake should have been nothing but glass under the moonlight, yet a faint ripple broke the silence. I pulled the curtain back, just enough to look, expecting a loon or a drifting branch. Instead, a small rowboat hovered unnaturally still on the black water. A single figure sat inside, upright and motionless, its face turned directly toward the house. No sound of oars, no creak of wood, only the quiet weight of being watched. My first thought was that someone had drifted too far from shore, maybe a fisherman asleep. But the boat never swayed, and the figure never moved. With every passing second, the line between an innocent mistake and something else thinned. My skin prickled as the stillness dragged on, until the normal night outside no longer felt normal at all, only uncanny and wrong. We had rented the lake house for spring break, a place tucked so far off the highway it felt like a private world. It was just me and 2 close friends, people I trusted enough to let the silence stretch without feeling awkward. The first day carried the kind of freedom we hadn't felt in months. No deadlines, no alarms, no obligations beyond choosing which chair to collapse into by the water. We grilled burgers on the back deck, the smoky smell drifting across the still lake, while our laughter carried and bounced back from the far shore. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. Creaky floorboards, mismatched mugs, windows that framed nothing but trees and water. The isolation felt like a shield, as if distance alone could guarantee safety. But even in those first hours, before the sun slipped behind the tree line, I caught myself noticing how quickly the world could feel too quiet. Late that first evening, when the sky had dimmed to violet and the lake reflected only a faint shimmer, we spotted a small rowboat, sitting unusually close to our dock. It had no motor, no lantern, nothing to suggest anyone was out fishing. At first, I thought maybe it had come loose from somewhere downshore, a harmless accident. One of my friends lifted a hand and waved, calling out a casual hey. The silhouette inside didn't stir. No shift of the shoulders, no answering gesture, just the outline of someone seated, facing us. The stillness made my throat tighten, though I tried to laugh it off. Boats drift, people zone out, it happens. Yet the longer we watched, the clearer it became that the boat wasn't drifting at all. It sat anchored in the water like it belonged there, the figure frozen, as if waiting. Coincidence no longer felt like the right word. By nightfall the boat had crept nearer, though none of us had seen it move. No splash of oars, no sound of wood against water, just the uncanny fact that it now floated a stone's throw from our dock. We tried to rationalize, convincing ourselves it was anchored and the breeze had nudged it closer. Still, the figure inside never shifted, and that silence pressed heavier than words. Around midnight, while we played cards in the living room, a hollow thud echoed from outside. It sounded like something striking the dock, once, then again, faint but deliberate. We froze, cards halfway to the table. One friend whispered it was probably a fish, or maybe the dock's old board settling, but no one moved to check. The truth was simpler. No one else should have been near that cove at this hour, and yet someone was steady, unblinking, making the dark water feel less like freedom and more like a trap. Unease finally pushed me to grab the heavy flashlight from the counter. When I swept its beam across the lake, the light cut through the black water like a blade. For a second it seemed I'd find nothing but the empty outline of the boat. Then the beam caught something that jolted me still. 2 reflective glints where I should have been. The figure shifted abruptly, turning away before the glare washed over it, retreating deeper into shadow. My pulse was hammered. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards groaning under my weight, as if the sound alone might give me away. The lake stayed quiet, too quiet, until a sudden splash broke the silence. Loud, close, the unmistakable sound of someone entering the water. I froze under the porch light, staring at ripples that spread and vanished into darkness, my own reflection wavering back as if daring me to believe what I'd seen. Morning brought no comfort. The sun burned away the mist, revealing a trail of wet footprints leading straight up from the water onto the dock. They were bare, human, spaced evenly like someone had walked with purpose. We followed them slowly, each step pressing dread deeper into my stomach. Halfway up the boards, the trail just stopped. No smudges onto the deck, no turn back toward the lake. No scattered drops where someone might have paused. It was as if the person had simply dissolved into thin air. We stood staring at the final print, toes pointed toward the house, realizing that whoever had been watching us wasn't just drifting offshore anymore. They had come closer, close enough to touch what we thought belonged only to us, and vanished on their own terms, leaving us powerless to explain it. That night the isolation turned against us. While we tried to distract ourselves with music playing on a phone, thin beams of light suddenly swept across the curtains, gliding from window to window as though someone circled the house deliberately. We killed the music and held our breath, counting each pass of the glow until it disappeared. Then came a jarring thud from beneath the dock, so heavy the whole structure rattled, dishes clinking in the cupboards. Another impact followed, sharp enough to send ripples slapping against the shore. We pulled together in the living room, whispering too fast, voices overlapping with fear. The truth pressed in from every side. We were surrounded by windows, walls that might as well have been transparent skin. Whoever was outside could see us, track us, choose their moment. Inside offered no safety now. It was only a cage with glass walls, and someone prowled. We couldn't spend another night waiting behind glass for whatever circled the house. In a rush of whispered agreement, we grabbed keys, bags, nothing more, and bolted for the door. The night air slapped cold against my face as we sprinted down the path toward the car. That's when the grinding scrape of wood on gravel froze me. The rowboat had reached shore. I spun, expecting the figure, but the boat sat rocking empty, water dripping from its sides. Before I could process it, one friend shouted for me to move. Behind us, through the wide windows of the house, a shadow streaked across the living room we had just abandoned. My heart lurched as the car roared to life. We tore down the dirt road, gravel spitting under the tires, the lake and the glass-walled trap shrinking behind us, while dread sat heavy that we hadn't truly escaped. In town the next day, we tried to explain what had happened, our voices stumbling over details that sounded impossible even to us. A shop owner just nodded, like he'd heard it all before. He told us people sometimes saw a man drifting out there at night, slipping silently between coves. A few claimed he boarded their docks, leaving only wet prints behind. Police were called more than once, but by the time they arrived the boat was always gone. The man vanished. Folks had given him a name, the Fisherman. No one knew where he came from or what he wanted, only that he watched in silence. Hearing that made our escape feel less like overreaction and more like survival. Yet every quiet night since, when the world stills, I can almost hear water lapping at wood, as though he's found another dock to claim. That lake house was supposed to be an escape, a pocket of peace away from the noise of everything else. But when you're cut off from the world, the same silence that feels freeing can just as easily become a trap. I learned how quickly comfort can shift into fear when something doesn't belong, when the ordinary turns just slightly wrong. If you ever rent a place that feels too quiet, trust your instincts. Ask locals about the area, check recent reports, and never ignore the feeling that something is off. Safety isn't just about locks and alarms. It's about listening to the unease your body warns you with. The memory of that boat still unsettles me, even now. And if this story kept you awake tonight, you're not the only one. Somewhere, someone else is watching the water, waiting for movement in the dark. The first sound was so sharp it cut straight through our late-night chatter. 3 deliberate knocks that echoed from inside the walls. We froze, the glow of the lamp throwing long shadows across the living room, the hum of the fridge suddenly louder than anything else. My father glanced at the front door, but the sound hadn't come from there. It had come from behind us, from the very wall against which our couch was pressed. Another knock followed, steady and hollow, as if someone were rapping from within the house itself. No footsteps, no voices, just that measured rhythm reverberating through wood and plaster. In that moment, every comfort of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, the view of the lake, shifted into something hostile. We weren't alone, and whatever had entered wasn't standing outside. It was already here, hidden just beyond reach. We'd booked the lake house as a quick weekend escape. Just the 4 of us, me, my wife, and our 2 kids. The place was modern, almost too polished for its rustic setting. with wide glass windows that looked out across the still water. On our first afternoon, the air was sharp with the scent of pine, the sun scattering across the ripples as the kids laughed and splashed in the shallows. My wife grilled on the deck, smoke curling lazily into the trees, while I leaned back in a chair and let the quiet sink in. It felt like we'd finally carved out a pocket of peace, a pause from our routines. The house stood at the edge of the woods, alone but inviting, a structure of light and glass. Its isolation made it feel like a safe cocoon. At least, that's what we believed then. On the second night, the weather turned. Wind pressed against the wide glass panes, rattling them in their frames as branches tapped from outside. I was settling into bed when I heard it, faint, irregular scratching coming from the wall behind the headboard. At first I dismissed it as mice, or maybe a trapped squirrel. Country houses always came with noises you didn't get in the city. But the sound didn't stay random. The scratching grew steady, then shifted into 3 distinct knocks, each one measured and patient. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but after a pause, the same pattern returned. Knock, knock, knock. Low and deliberate. It didn't sound like claws or chants anymore. It sounded intentional, like someone trying to make themselves known from inside the wall. The calm of the lake house evaporated, leaving only the certainty that something was terribly wrong. The knocks didn't stay confined to our bedroom. By the following evening, they began to echo from other walls, the living room, the hallway, always in the same slow rhythm, like a hand keeping time. Too precise for animals, too deliberate to be brushed off. One night, just after the kids had finally fallen asleep, a new sound joined the knocking, a long, drawn-out dragging noise that seemed to crawl directly across the ceiling above us. My stomach dropped because the house was a single story. I stared at the plaster overhead, listening as the weight shifted, inch by inch, across a space that shouldn't exist. My wife, pale but composed, whispered that maybe there was an attic the listing hadn't mentioned. Her words were meant to explain, to reassure, but they only deepened my unease. If there was an attic, someone, or something, was moving inside it. I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night I walked the perimeter of the house, testing each lock, sliding every window closed until the latches clicked firm. Nothing was disturbed. Inside, I pressed my ear to the bedroom wall where the knocking had begun. The wood was cool, lifeless, giving me nothing back. When I finally called the property manager, he sounded more annoyed than concerned. "No one else has access," he told me flatly, "and there is no attic. The crawl space above the ceiling is sealed. It's impossible for anyone to be up there." His words should have calmed me, but as I hung up, the sound began again. Slow knocks, perfectly spaced, echoing through the darkened house. Every light was on, every corner searched, and still something unseen moved freely within the walls, as though the house itself was keeping its secrets from us. When the noises didn't stop, I finally called the police. An officer arrived near midnight, his flashlight cutting across the glassy rooms as he checked every lock, every corner, even the crawl space beneath the deck. After a careful sweep, he shook his head. "The house is clear," he said, voice steady, almost impatient. Watching his cruiser disappear down the dirt road should have brought relief, but the silence that followed was worse. We gathered in the living room, straining for any sound. Then it came. 3 heavy knocks, this time from beneath us. The floorboards shuddered faintly under the impact, as if something was reaching up from the crawl space below. Control had left with the officer's taillights. What remained was the terrifying certainty that we weren't imagining it. Into the living room, no one else would believe every light blazing as if brightness alone could keep the fear out. For a moment the house felt suspended in glass, our small family adrift on display in the middle of the dark woods. Then the knock started again, sharper now, echoing from one wall to the next. They stretched into scraping sounds, nails or something harder dragging across plaster. From the vents above, a faint hiss slipped down, and I realized it wasn't the wind at all but whispers. Words too low to catch yet unmistakably human. The kids clung to us, eyes wide, while our reflections stared back in every pane of glass, pale and trembling. Beyond those windows stretched only blackness. We couldn't see what was outside, but it could see us, and with every sound the walls seemed less like shelter and more like thin skin waiting to split. At some point, survival overrode hesitation. We shoved clothes into bags, grabbed the kids by the hands, and moved as quickly as we could toward the door. Every nerve screamed at me to keep scanning the glass, expecting a shape to emerge from the dark, but nothing showed itself. Outside, the air was damp and heavy, pine needles crunching beneath our shoes as we rushed to the car. My wife fumbled the keys, metal clinking loud in the silence, and just as the trunk slammed shut, a deafening thud echoed from inside the house. It was violent, final, like a door slamming though we'd left everything open. None of us dared look back. Tires spat gravel as we tore down the dirt road, the house shrinking behind us, but the sound still reverberating in our chests. Proof we hadn't imagined any of it. Back home, I couldn't shake it. Sleep came in fragments, every creak of our own house setting my nerves on edge. Out of restless curiosity, I searched the lake house listing again, scrolling through older reviews. That's when I saw them, casual mentions from past guests about housekeeper visits at night, footsteps in the halls, doors closing softly. None of them sounded alarmed, almost as if they'd assumed it was routine. But the property manager had been firm. No staff, no one else allowed on the grounds. The contradiction left me cold. Whatever had been inside those walls hadn't just been a quirk of an old house. Others had brushed against it too, and no one had ever gotten an answer. For us, the silence that followed was the worst part. Silence that felt like someone holding their breath, waiting. What unsettles me most isn't the memory of the knocks or even the whispers through the vents. It's the not knowing. Were we dealing with a person slipping in and out of that house unseen, or something older that had claimed the walls long before we arrived? The police told us nothing was wrong. The manager swore no one else had access. But our instincts screamed otherwise, and instincts are often the only warning we get. I learned that night that safety isn't guaranteed just because someone in authority says so. Sometimes vigilance is all you have, and ignoring it can cost more than sleep. If you've ever heard sounds you couldn't explain, you're not alone. Share your story, because every voice adds weight to the truth that not everything fits neatly into silence or denial. Fog clung to the lake like a living thing, swallowing the far shore until only gray water stretched ahead. I stood at the cabin window, arms wrapped tight against the chill, when a faint glow appeared across the surface. A lantern, small, steady, hovering in the mist as though someone were standing there, watching. I blinked, trying to clear my eyes, and suddenly there were two. The second one burned brighter, nearer, positioned halfway across the water where no boat had been a moment earlier. My breath caught, frosting the glass, as I realized I hadn't seen it drift forward. It had just appeared, closer than before. In that instant, the lake stopped being a quiet backdrop and became a stage, and I was no longer certain if I was meant to be the audience or the target. I'd rented the cabin to get away, to trade the endless buzz of city life for something simpler. The place was small but charming, pine beams that groaned with every shift of the wind, the faint earthy smell of damp wood, and windows that looked out onto the endless stretch of water. During the day, it felt like a dream. I spent hours reading by the fire, listening to the steady lap of waves against the shore, each sound blending into a rhythm that lulled me into calm. Meals were slow, mornings were quiet, and I told myself this was exactly what I needed, solitude without distraction. But when the sun sank, that same stillness grew heavy. Darkness poured across the lake, swallowing the world until the cabin felt less like a retreat and more like a bubble floating in nothing. What had felt safe and restorative by day now carried the suggestion of unseen eyes in the night. That first night, as I settled into the cabin's silence, I noticed a glow across the water. A lantern, steady, golden, almost comforting at first. My mind went to ordinary explanations. Maybe a late-night fisherman, maybe another cabin tucked in the trees. But the lake was supposed to be private, ringed only by forest. No voices carried over, no hum of a boat motor, nothing but the faint hiss of flame. The stillness was absolute, so complete that the flicker looked out of place, like a mistake on an otherwise blank canvas. I watched it for a long while, waiting for movement, a shadow, some sign of human presence. None came. The flame never wavered, never dimmed, just glowed like it had always been there, like it had been waiting to be seen. The second night, the glow returned, but this time there were two. One flickered faintly on the far bank, exactly where it had been before. The other, impossibly, burned closer, on the dirt path leading toward the cabin. My chest tightened as I pressed my face to the window, trying to focus through the fog. The nearer lantern glowed steady. No footsteps, no figure carrying it, just light where there shouldn't have been any. I turned to grab my phone, to take a picture, but when I looked back, only the far lantern remained, calm and unmoving in the distance. My pulse hammered in my ears. Maybe I was overtired, maybe my eyes had doubled the flame, but the path outside was dark now, and I couldn't shake the thought that for a moment, something had been standing much closer than it should have. Contrast, trust versus doubt. By the third night, curiosity clawed at me harder than fear. I dug out a pair of old binoculars from my bag and pressed them to my eyes, scanning the far bank. The glass caught shapes, vague, human-like silhouettes, but each time I adjusted the focus, they blurred into nothing but trees and mist. My pulse urged me outside. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning under my weight like a warning. The cold air bit at my skin as I stared across the lake. That's when I heard it, faint, deliberate splashes, the rhythm of oars slicing through water. I strained to see, but the lake's surface was smooth, reflecting only the pale glow of the lantern. No boat, no figure, no movement, just the sound where sight failed me, as if something unseen was steadily crossing closer. Contrast, light versus dark / seen versus unseen. I woke to a glow bleeding through the curtains. Pulling them back, my breath caught. Not one lantern, not two, but several, scattered like a ring around the cabin. Each one burned steady. Their light reflected off the fog, like watchful eyes. My stomach sank with the realization. This wasn't a lone camper, or even a prank. There were many of them, moving with quiet coordination, closing off every path to the lake or the road. From inside, I felt suddenly small, caged by glass walls and silence. For the first time, it struck me. I wasn't just being watched. I was being surrounded. Contrast, control versus powerlessness. The crunch of footsteps circled the cabin, deliberate and slow, as if whoever was out there wanted me to know they weren't rushing. Then, through the misted glass, a pale hand pressed flat, dragging down until a streak cut the fog. My pulse thundered as I grabbed my phone, but the signal bar vanished to nothing did. The silence inside the cabin was unbearable, broken only by the creak of settling wood. Every window felt like an open invitation, every wallpaper thin. No locks, no curtains thick enough to shield me. I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that I was never hidden, just exposed, lit up from within like prey in a glass cage. Contrast, inside versus outside. Heart pounding. I stuffed my bag with shaking hands and bolted out the door, gravel crunching loud enough to betray every step. My car sat in the dark like salvation, and I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them. When the headlights finally blazed on, the beams swept across the shoreline, and there they were, dozens of silhouettes, retreating into the treeline, their lanterns swaying like pendulums of fire. Some paused, watching, before vanishing into the fog. My foot slammed the gas. Tires spun, spraying gravel, the cabin shrinking in the rearview. I didn't dare look back long, but in the glow of the receding lake, faint lights flickered, as though the lanterns had never stopped burning. Contrast, action versus freeze. By dawn, I reached the nearest town, exhausted and trembling. When I mentioned what I'd seen, the locals exchanged uneasy glances, but gave no clear answers. One older man finally muttered, "Best to leave that lake alone. Always been that way." Others avoided eye contact, speaking in hushed tones about gatherings and outsiders not welcome. No one offered details, but the silence spoke louder than words. The whispers echoed old rumors I'd half heard before, stories of cults, rituals, and figures who appear only by lantern light. Whether folklore or fact, I'll never know. What I do know is that the glow still lingers in my memory, as if those lanterns were never meant to be extinguished. Contrast, noise versus silence. I still think about that night whenever I picture a quiet lake, Peaceful places have a way of hiding what outsiders are meant to see. And sometimes the scariest part isn't the danger itself, it's the not knowing. Were those lanterns just locals keeping tradition, or something older, something darker that thrives on secrecy? The truth slipped back into the fog, leaving me only with the memory of being watched. If you've ever felt eyes on you in the dark, you know how quickly peace can turn to dread. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and don't ignore the little signs that tell you something is wrong. If this story hits close to home, share your own experience, because sometimes knowing you're not alone is the only light we have. Contrast complacency versus vigilance.